Everybody, this is Biblical Minute Clinic. This is where we go through books of the Bible, starting with the New Testament, where we see the reason they were written and where we highlight some keynotes about those passages. This is just trying to get you a context of the text. We need to go back right before the books of the New Testament started. First, we need to go back to Acts chapter 6. Now, the book of Acts is a history book written by a doctor, Luke, who was a co-worker of Paul the Apostle. Now, you know Paul. He's the Apostle Paul, the writer that wrote most books of the New Testament. In Acts 1-5, Luke records how the young Christian church is a mixture of Jewish folk who stayed close to their Jewish customs and Jewish folk who adopted the Greek culture and language. All of these people became Christians and they sold their land. They lived together. They had a unified purpose. They saw themselves as the followers of Jesus. They were Christians, but there were problems. And we start to see these problems early on in the book of Acts. And this is why we're saying going back to Acts chapter 6. So now in Acts chapter 6, what was going on? Because remember, these people had sold everything. They sold their land. They collected money. The apostles, the 12 apostles, this doesn't include Paul, by the way. These were the original followers of Jesus minus Judas. Now, what wound up happening in Acts chapter 6 is that there was a daily collection for the widows. Now, mind you, widows in that culture, these were women who they lost their husband and they might not have had the cultural, societal support structures that we have today. So what you would have is usually their kids would take care of them. But if they didn't have kids, they were true widows and they had to be taking care of somebody. Usually these were the poorest people of society. But if this group of early Christians were joining together, they started taking it upon themselves to take care of these widows. Now, what was happening is that those Greek culture Jews, they were being neglected by the people, the Jews, the Jewish Christians who came from the Hebrew culture. So there was money being collected and food being collected for these people, and the Greek culture Jewish widows were being neglected. They weren't getting their portion. So what wound up happening is that there was a bit of a row. There was people that were complaining about this, and they said, this is a problem. So the apostles, who were doing a lot already, remember, they were they were preaching, they were preparing for mission journeys, they were collecting money already. They saw this problem of taking care of these widows. They said, you know what, you community, you pick some people, you pick some 7 people, go ahead, pick these men, and let them be in charge of this. So the community, they picked 7 leaders. And these leaders are maybe from the Greek culture. Who knows? It could be, they could be Greek culture Jews, but it could also be that they're just Hebrew Jews with Greek culture names. But that doesn't matter. What matters is that they also had other jobs. This wasn't their only job of caring for the collection for these widows. One of them, for example, was a preacher who was performing miracles. That's pretty impressive. Another one was another preacher too, Philip. But here, why we're looking in Acts chapter 6, is that we see one of them, Acts chapter 6, is Stephen, who is doing a lot of work. Now, one of the things he did is that he would have debates with what was called the Synagogue of the Freedmen. These are people who are Jews who come from abroad, Cyrene, Alexandria, Cilicia, Asia. These are Greek culture Jews, and they're having discussions, strong discussions, probably with Stephen, who is possibly also a Greek culture Jew. They're having debates about certain issues. Now, the Synagogue of the Freedmen, it's because that they used to be slaves. They were slaves of the Romans, and then they've been let go. They've been emancipated, and they had a synagogue together. So these people were together, and they also had very strong opinions. What wound up happening is that they start having a specific debate with Stephen, probably about who Jesus is and how he's the Messiah. And Stephen's turning the debate to show that God's chosen person has always been rejected by the Jews. Now, this got those Greek culture Jews very upset. And what they did was they rushed him out of the city and they stoned him to death. And this happens in Acts chapter 7. after he preaches a sermon to them. Basically, it's during a debate. Now, standing by the side of the killers, a young man waiting there while these killers who are going to stone Stephen, they're taking off their coats, probably because they're hot, and laying at his feet, is this young man named Saul. Now, Saul later on becomes Paul the apostle, but at this point, he is in complete agreement with what's going on. He wants this execution to happen. And later on, we see him going around and he's arresting Jewish Christians. He's carrying letters with him. Now, mind you, what happens here in Acts chapter 7 changes everything, because up until then, these Jewish Christians were living in Jerusalem, and they would have debates with other Jews, and they would get arrested and let go. But in all honesty, they weren't facing the level of persecution that happened here. Once Stephen gets stoned to death, now it's all out. Now they're trying to arrest these people. Now they're going after them. They're taking their property. And it changes everything, like I said. So this little church in Jerusalem starts getting persecuted. And all these Jewish Christians spread out, and they ran to all other regions. Ironically, because what's happening here is that the Jews are trying to squash this religious sect, which they see as heretical. And by trying to squash it, it actually spreads out further than the borders of Jerusalem and Galilee. It goes out to Judea and to Samaria and to the far parts. All these people spread out. And at the same time, like I said, Saul starts to persecute the church by arresting people. It's with this backdrop that we get the first book written in the New Testament. The first book written in the New Testament. And that was the book of James, which we'll get to next time in our Biblical Minute Clinic.